Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak. I direct International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, which is another in the series on terrorism and homeland security that the Woodrow Wilson Center and the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series have sponsored since June 2004. And I'd like to acknowledge Major John Pryor, the manager of that program, and his colleagues are here today. We're very grateful for the support that the Army through the Eisenhower Series has provided for this series. Today, the Wilson Center and the Army are delighted that Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies can join us as an institutional co-sponsor of this series, which will be continuing through the autumn and into the next calendar year. The aim of the series, since its the establishment of it in mid-2004, has been to stimulate informed discussion and debate on the problem of terrorism and the most effective means to address it. The meetings have provided a forum in which experts from diverse professional groups, government, academia, business, etc., can meet on a regular basis to hear presentations by preeminent international experts on topical issues and to exchange views and information. Today's meeting is special because our speaker is the co-chair of this series, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who is a world-renowned expert on terrorism. I'd like to embarrass and take by mentioning Bruce's spouse. Hadana is here. Welcome, as well as his parents, David and Audrey Hoffman. Welcome them to today's meeting. We meet as the 5th anniversary of 9/11 approaches, and that date coincides with the publication of Bruce's new book. It's a revised and expanded edition of his landmark study, Inside Terrorism. Available for purchase at a marvelous price of $20 outside the store. It is a seminal work for understanding the historical evolution of terrorism and the terrorist mindset. It is the definitive work on the history and future of global terrorism. Walter Lacour, the Dean of Terrorism Studies, has stated, Hoffman's book is the best work about terrorism in the last decade. In addressing today's topic, 5 years after 9/11, terrorism trends and implications, Bruce will outline the main themes of his book. Afterwards, there'll be a reception in the Moynihan boardroom, just adjacent to this room, and there'll be an opportunity for those who so desire to purchase the book and can have the author will be available for signing it. Bruce needs no introduction to this audience. But for the record, he was recently appointed Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Prior to Georgetown, he was director of the RAND Corporation's Washington, D.C. office. He was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he was also a reader in international relations and chairman of the Department of International Relations. He's served as a member of the United States Department of Defense's Counterterrorism Advisory Board, has served as a consultant to the National Academy of Sciences, Department of Energy, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, the General Accounting Office, etc. He's the editor-in-chief of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, which is the leading journal in the field of terrorism studies. He received his PhD, or as they say over in Britain, at Oxford, where he received a DPhil in international relations. He's also, I'm happy to mention, a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson Center was created by Congress to memorialize our 28th president by serving as a bridge between the worlds of learning and the worlds of action. Bruce Hoffman epitomizes that Wilsonian ideal, and it's my great pleasure to turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Rob, for really that exceedingly kind introduction, and thank you to the audience for coming to this particular talk. There's not many second acts in life, but it's nice to know that at least on occasion a second edition of a book at least attracts some interest and some attention. And actually, I neglected to tell Rob this. I've just returned from 5 weeks overseas about a week ago, and it's been a very hectic week. I'm actually not going to talk about the book, which you may judge to be a good or a bad thing. I mean, I'm sure if you had read the first edition, you'll know that every word is a jewel valued beyond human computation. So I'm going to leave it to you to find that out. And I'm actually going to zero in on the trends, which actually takes off from the last chapter of the book. But I would be remiss after this extremely nice build-up and this very kind woman outside who's selling copies of the book not to say just a few words about it. And that's to say that my wife advised me many times over I guess I completed it last July, over the period that I was writing it, that I just should have done a new book, which was true, especially in respect to the fact that I more than doubled the original word length. The first edition was 90,000 words, and the second edition was something like 70,000. So it really is almost a new book. There's completely new chapters on suicide terrorism, which is a subject that I've had a particular interest in, going back actually to 1997. But of course, that's been intensified since the 9/11 attacks 5 years ago. There's another completely new chapter, I think, at least one of my favorite of chapters amongst these many jewels in the first edition was the one on the media, and I've retitled that to the original chapter Old Media, and there's a new chapter on New Media, which in effect I think is really the revolution we see in terrorist communications, whereby terrorists through the internet and through the 5,000 plus sites that are now maintained by terrorist groups are able to quite effectively direct their message to audiences without the filter or the editing or the censorship of either state or commercial media. So that's the entirely new second chapter. The first chapter is being expanded with a discussion of obviously the war on terrorism, and in particular what I take great exception to terming it the war on terror, because terror after all is an emotion, it's a fear, and if we label something a war on terror, basically anything that scares us or anything that we're afraid of can justify a response. I also have an expanded discussion, I think, which is enormously important now, of the distinctions between not just as existed in the first edition, terrorism and guerrilla warfare, but now we can add the concept of insurgency to that pantheon. So there's an expanded discussion of the differences and the similarities between terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and insurgency, and of course, a discussion of both our involvement in Iraq and the repercussions. But honestly, I don't want to dwell on the book, and I want to actually leverage off of the final chapter, which I wrote, as I said, over a year ago. And it talked about really the state of al-Qaeda at the time. And I think, fortunately, or I can touch wood, I got it almost right. And that really is the subject of my presentation today. And I suppose it was advertised as trends and developments in terrorism in the past 5 years, but the subheading would be, or the title that I think really refers to the crux of my remarks, is Al-Qaeda in retreat or on the march. And I think this is an enormously important subject for the reasons I will tell you in a second. 5 years ago, of course, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes and changed the course of history. Any doubt that the threat to commercial aviation has been reduced at all was shattered, of course, last month when the alleged plot to blow up 10 American airliners while in flight over the Atlantic was uncovered. And this, I think, reminds us very much how vulnerable we still are to massive terrorist attack. And as my friend and colleague, Dr. Walter Reich, has observed in conversation the past few days, I mean, basically that would have been another 9/11. I mean, but for the intelligence breakthrough that averted it. And I think this goes really to the core of the problem, that just as we underestimated al-Qaeda then, in the months and the years leading up to 9/11, I would argue we risk repeating the same mistake now. For instance, al-Qaeda today is frequently described as in retreat, as a broken and beaten organization, incapable of mounting further attacks on its own, that has devolved operational authority either to its various affiliates and associates or to entirely organically produced homegrown terrorist entities. In my view, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, al-Qaeda is on the march. It is regrouped and reorganized from the setbacks meted out by the United States and our allies and partners in the aftermath of 9/11. And al-Qaeda today is marshaling its forces to continue the war that Osama bin Laden declared 10 years ago with his then mostly ignored fatwa. In this respect, al-Qaeda is functioning just as its founders envisioned it, as both an inspiration and an organization that simultaneously is capable of summoning a broad universe of like-minded extremists to violence, while still providing guidance and assistance for more spectacular terrorist operations. On the one hand, therefore, al-Qaeda remains true to its name, the base of operation or the foundation, from which a worldwide Islamist revolution can be waged by inspiring radicalized Muslims to join the movement's holy fight. While on the other, al-Qaeda continues to exercise its core operational and command and control capabilities, directing and implementing terrorist attacks, including perhaps the recently thwarted airline bombings in London, or in England rather, and certainly the 7705 suicide bombings that were targeted against the London Underground in a bus nearly a year ago, as well as the foiled 2004 plot to stage simultaneous suicide attacks on economic targets in Lower Manhattan, in Newark, New Jersey, and in Washington, D.C. Accordingly, the fundamental challenge that we face in effectively countering terrorism can be summed up thus. Given the threat's dynamic and evolutionary character, and our adversaries' ability to adapt and adjust their tactics and modus operandi to obviate even our most consequential countermeasures, how can we best ensure that our own assessments and analyses are anchored firmly to sound empirical judgment and are not blinded by either conjecture, mirror imaging, politically partisan prisms, or wishful thinking? The 705 London bombings encapsulate precisely the threat posed by al-Qaeda today and the challenges we face in defending against it. I will argue the challenge is not entirely or exclusively one of homegrown radicalization, but also of deliberate subversion as well. Now, to do this, let me lay out the remainder of the talk. I first want to very briefly remind you about the London attacks of last year and, in fact, who the four perpetrators were. Then very briefly, let me tell you about the British authorities and their response to the London bombings, both then and since. And then finally, in just a few words, conclude with at least some summation or observations on what lessons we need to learn from the 7/7 bombings and the British response to them. So let me first turn to the four bombers. The leader of the group was someone named Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, who was age 30, known now as MSK, much like we call Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, although he was known to his friends as Sid, in fact. The next eldest member of the group was probably his closest confederate or companion, a 22-year-old man named Shahzad Tanweer. The youngest of the group was Hasib Hussain, age 18. Now, these three share a number of demographic traits in common. They were all born in the United Kingdom of South Asian parentage. Their parents were from Pakistan. They all grew up in the same area, which I'll discuss in a second, outside of Leeds, called Beastin. But then the fourth member of the group, and at least from my perspective, one of the most interesting, was completely different. He was neither born in the United Kingdom, nor born a Muslim, nor from South Asia. His name was Germaine Lindsay. He was age 19. He was born in Jamaica. He emigrated to the United Kingdom. In fact, was a Muslim convert. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them, and I think this is enormously important because they really shatter our stereotypes of the suicidal, fanatical terrorist. For instance, MSK, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, known by Sid to his friends, was described by all who knew him as, quote unquote, quiet, studious, and never in trouble. Rather than our stereotype of the fanatical terrorist foaming at the mouth, bloodthirsty in intentions and motivations, MSK actually was employed. He wasn't from the maw of poverty, for example. He was married. He had a young daughter. And his job was as a community worker. And he was actually had a very positive reputation in his neighborhood as being a particularly effective and empathetic community worker. If he was remembered for one thing before the 7/7 bombings, it was that in 2001 and 2002, he was what the British call a supply teacher. He was a substitute teacher in a local elementary school for physically disabled and mentally disabled children. And those who knew him then remarked at how profoundly empathetic he was, how effective he was with dealing with these both physically and mentally challenged children. So he was very positively thought of. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this point in a second, in recent years he had visited Pakistan twice, once in 2003 and again in 2004 and 2005. On the second trip, he was accompanied by Shahzad Tanweer. Tanweer was slightly different from MSK. He was religious from a very young age, and noticeably, but he didn't seem to harbor any kind of political views, much less radical ones. Like MSK, he was university educated. They went to the same university, but because there was an 8-year difference, they obviously weren't students at the same time. They both went to Leeds Metropolitan University. Tanweer, in fact, studied sports science at Leeds, and that's what he had his degree in. And in fact, he was remembered by those who knew him before the bombing as, quote unquote, a gifted sportsman, someone who is a very, very keen, as we would say, athlete, but as they would say in the UK, a gifted sportsman. And in fact, on the night before the bombings of the London Underground and the London bus, Tanweer behaved exactly as he would have on any other summer's evening in the United Kingdom. He could be seen at the local park engaging in his favorite pastime, indeed the thing that he was really remembered as having a passion for, which was playing cricket. Now, again, our stereotype of the suicidal terrorist is also someone not only who's uneducated, who's poor, but again, Tanweer shatters both of those preconceptions. Not only was he well educated, but his father was one of the wealthiest members of this community of Beastin. He owned a string of fish and chip shops, in fact, where Tanweer had worked. He had stopped working at them in November 2004 when he went with MSK to Pakistan. When he returned, he did not go back to his job because basically he was involved in planning the London attacks almost full time. Interestingly, too, for those who have stereotypes about suicidal terrorists, he drove a red Mercedes sports car. So he was not someone from, again, the stereotypical background. Now, Hussain, who was the youngest, is someone that was remembered as, quote unquote, quiet with a very few friends. Perhaps he conforms a bit more to our stereotype. He wasn't a very good student. He didn't complete school. He drifted into petty criminality. He wasn't terribly religious, but in 2002, his family made the Hajj, or the pilgrimage, to Saudi Arabia, and 2 years later, he himself became devoutly religious. Now, unlike at least his two companions from Leeds, he was quite vociferous and quite open about his radicalism, whereas MSK and Shahzad Tanweer never given any indication that they were particularly enamored of bin Laden's philosophy or particularly supportive of al-Qaeda. Hussain was quite open in his praise of the 9/11 attacks and indeed of al-Qaeda himself. He was described, though, as perhaps the most impressionable and the one individual most likely to be a follower and therefore to be entranced perhaps by a charismatic leader and to have been, let's say, drawn into a plot and perhaps not having the self-possession or the confidence to avoid being sucked deeper in it. Now, the ones, I think, if you want to try to profile at least these three individuals, the one thing that they did have in common is that they all were very keen sportsmen, and Hussain was no exception to that. That was the other thing that he was remembered about, is that became rather devout later in life, was openly radical, the only one really of the four who was like that, but was also, like his two companions from Beastin, a very avid sportsman and a very good athlete. And similarly, that's how one would describe Germaine Lindsay, the convert to Islam who was born in Jamaica. In fact, people remember Germaine Lindsay in two ways. One set of people remembered him, quote unquote, as being artistic and musical. Again, hardly our stereotype of the suicide terrorist. And also as being, quote, a bright child, a good student, and someone very good at sports. In fact, martial arts and kickboxing were his passion, not so much cricket. His mother converted to Islam in 2000, and Germaine Lindsay followed suit. He also was married and had a child. In fact, he met his wife on the internet. Their first date was a Stop the War rally in London, Stop the War in Iraq in 2002. But he, even though he was remembered as being bright and a good child, he was somewhat adrift in life, and he never really found what he wanted to do as a career. In fact, his main profession before he died in a suicide attack last year was petty criminality, dealing in drugs and also trafficking in automatic weapons. But he was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a stupid person. I mean, far from that. Once he converted to Islam, he attained fluency in Arabic within a year. Now, those of you perhaps like myself who have studied Arabic know that it's an enormously difficult language. In fact, in the time I studied it, I certainly didn't get anything to close to fluency and therefore abandoned it. But Germaine Lindsay not only stayed with Arabic and became fluent, but within an equally short period of time, he memorized the Quran, which of course is a great honor in Islam, and at the mosque where he worshipped was viewed as someone who was not only enormously intelligent, but was someone who you could go to for discussions on the Quran and for various exegeses and explanations. So that's the 4 bombers. Let's review very briefly what is known about the attacks that took place in London more than a year ago. The Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, which conducted an investigation and held hearings during the beginning of this year, issued its report in May 2006. And if you haven't read it, you can get it very easily on the internet. I would urge you to read it. It's much shorter than, for instance, our 9/11 Commission's report. It's only about 60 pages, and there's a companion report, but it makes absolutely fascinating reading. I think it's one of the most important documents on terrorism or at least of the analyses of the terrorist threat that we have now. And among the things that the report at least concluded at the time, but have in fact become even clearer, is that this group of 4 bombers that had gravitated towards one another, or I think, and I'll argue in a second, had been deliberately recruited by Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, was clearly in contact with other radicals and extremists in the United Kingdom right up until the attack. So although the media, many government spokesmen, both in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, portrayed this very much as a lone wolf attack, as a homegrown, entirely self-radicalized, self-selected threat, self-selected plot, what we see is that these 4 individuals in this cell did not operate completely in isolation. They were clearly in contact, according to the London Parliament and various other information, that they were clearly in contact with other radicals and extremists in the United Kingdom right up in the attack. The parliamentary report also concluded that they almost certainly, I actually would go further, since May, I think we can say that they almost definitely received advice and direction from individuals based in Pakistan. It's now known that they visited Pakistani jihadi training camps in Pakistan, that in fact Shahzad Tanweer was up near the border of Afghanistan at other camps. The advice and direction that they received, Parliament hedging its bets, or the Parliamentary Committee said, somewhat conditioned their conclusion, but said may well have continued up until the attack itself. There's no proof that it did, but there's certainly a strong suspicion. And it seems increasingly likely that the reason that at least MSK and Tanweer went to Pakistan was to acquire the necessary skills and expertise to construct the bombs that were used in the attacks, which I'll describe in a second, and also, I think, to obtain the tradecraft, the ability to detect surveillance, or to see if they themselves were being surveilled or watched by the authorities, and thus ensure the success of the attack was doubtless, or quite likely, something else they picked up in Pakistan. The planning for the attack, as I said a moment ago, appears to have begun immediately upon their return to the United Kingdom on the 5th of February, 2005. Now, as I said, interestingly, Khan himself had made a previous visit to Pakistan in 2003, of which, at least in open source terms, very little is known. But fascinatingly, there's some suspicion, still unconfirmed, but there's some suspicion that MSK himself may have visited an al-Qaeda camp in 1999. And this came to light after, of course, the 7/7 attacks. The photographs of all 4 bombers were splashed across the front pages of British newspapers. They were a regular staple or feature of the evening news. And someone who had been a confident informant for MI5, the British Security Service, for some time, was watching the news, apparently recognized MSK, went to his handler or to his case officer and said, I recognize him. I was in an al-Qaeda camp with him in either 1999 or 2000. Now, that's not yet verified, but the accumulation of evidence suggests that this wasn't just 4 people who came together and decided to stage an attack. There's, I think, a rather longer pedigree and at least a trail of suspicion. And I think now we could even push that further and say that rather than the organic, entirely homegrown threat that was originally portrayed, a clear al-Qaeda involvement at least one dimension, I would argue multiple dimensions, but let's say the easiest that one can discuss in this forum, is that at least one dimension is clear. And this is that both MSK and Shahzad Tanweer made martyrdom tapes, as we've seen the 19 hijackers have made, as suicide terrorists routinely do in many parts of the world. But the key here is that if you remember both those tapes, MSK's was released on the 1st of September 2005. Tanweer's was just released 2 months ago to coincide with the first anniversary of the attacks. And if you recall, in the lower left-hand corner of both those tapes is the imprimatur, the seal of Ash-Sahab, the Clouds, al-Qaeda's media arm. So clearly they had some contact with al-Qaeda's perennially active media arm. But there's more suspicions from various sources that while in Pakistan, and perhaps while they were up, at least Tanweer was up near the Afghani border, that they may well have also come into contact with al-Qaeda operatives. Now, I told you that they had traveled to Pakistan to learn how to fabricate the bomb and plan the attacks. And the reason I say this, too, is that it's entirely true, as the media and as the authorities presented it, that the bombs that were used in London were constructed from completely accessible, totally commercially available materials, that they were homemade bombs. That's true. In fact, the device was made with an explosive compound called hexamethylene triperoxide diamine, HMTD. And it is entirely true, as the media said. You can go home tonight. If you do a Google search for HMTD, I can assure you on the first page you will come up with at least 2 or 3 recipes for how to make this kind of explosive. But as easy or as tantalizing as it might be to go to the internet and then to make your own bomb, you'll also find numerous warnings that this is an enormously unstable explosive. You really have to know what you're going to do, or else you could make a tragic mistake and blow yourself up. In fact, it's believed that Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was basically fabricating or brewing up a batch of HMTD when, of course, it blew up in 1995 in an apartment in Manila and then laid bare to the previous plot to bomb American Airlines while in flight. In that case, it was over the Pacific. So HMTD may indeed be made from citric acid, hydrogen peroxide, which after all is used in hair bleach, methyl or ethyl alcohol, and water. But by the same time, it's not that you can just go to the local pharmacy or chemist, as they would say in the United Kingdom, and buy these types of materials. Hydrogen peroxide is about 3% strength when you buy it in a pharmacy. You need about 70%. I have no scientific expertise, so I'm just relying on what people have told me in this respect. But you need about 70% strength of hydrogen peroxide to make HMTD. So you don't just go to a beauty supply store or to the local hairdressers. I mean, you have to know what to look for and have at least the knowledge and the experience to be able to ask for it and to get it from a chemical supplier. And just to give you some idea of how dangerous these types of, and how toxic these compounds are, that you really have to know what you're doing and be determined. When the police raided Alexandra Gardens in Leeds, which was where the safe house where the bomb factory was, they discovered in the apartment that MSK and Tanweer had rented that the fumes were so noxious that the wallpaper had been stripped off the walls. This was a very nice middle-class area. There were flower boxes, as many of us have outside of our own apartments or houses. The police found that in the flower boxes, excuse me, outside of Alexandra Grove, the tops of the plants had all died because of the fumes. In fact, in the weeks leading up to the attack, the parents of both Tanweer and Hussain were bothering them why they were dyeing their hair, why they were bleaching their hair a lighter color. And in retrospect, what it appears is they were mixing the explosives, and the explosives themselves were so powerful that they were dyeing their hair. So maybe, in theory, easy to make, but you have to firstly be very determined. You have to know what you're doing so you don't blow yourself up, as even an experienced bomb maker like Ramzi Ahmed Youssef had. And you have to be awfully determined to deal with chemicals like that. The bombers' modus operandi, I would argue, in general, and their demeanor conforms to everything we know about suicide bombers. In that sense, there isn't much of a surprise. I think the terrorist organizations in particular, and often the suicide bombers themselves, want to depict these types of attacks as born of this profound rage, this intense frustration, this powerful emotion that can only be released by engaging in a suicide attack, that it's something very spontaneous and something emotional. We know from suicide attacks really around the world that nothing could be further from the truth. That, in fact, these types of attacks, like many other terrorist plots, are premeditated, plotted, and planned. And certainly this was the case. And we have evidence of this by the fact that exactly a week before the 7/7 attacks, MSK, Tanweer, and Lindsay are captured on CCTV closed-circuit television footage actually doing a dry run or doing a reconnaissance of exactly the trains and the tube stops where they would attack a week later. Clearly, the attack was also instrumental, again, planned and premeditated. One thing that the parliamentary report concluded, which I think again goes away from this notion of entirely amateurish, homegrown terrorists, is they observed, quote, that the discipline and that the attacks evidence discipline and meticulous planning with very good security awareness. The British authorities and police who testified before Parliament remarked about the plotters' very careful use of mobile phones so they could not be traced, and their very careful use also of rental cars, not to leave any evidence. And we recall the 1993 World Trade Center plot, of course. It unraveled when Mohammed Salameh went back to the Ryder truck rental depot and tried to, of course, reclaim his deposit on the truck that had just blown up. So they were very careful in both those respects. In fact, the British authorities believed that Khan himself was worried about surveillance, and that he had advised them, his Confederates, to be very careful, and that Khan himself had practiced, at least the Parliament report concluded from the testimony of the authorities, that this was a group that practiced some counter-surveillance and very good tradecraft at ensuring the success of their plot. The four bombers acted completely normally when they arrived at Luton, when they departed from Luton train station and arrived at King's Cross on the morning of the 7th of July. So again, unlike some of our preconceptions of suicide terrorists, people who are sweating profusely or perhaps smiling beatifically or perhaps have this mindless 1,000-yard stare, there was nothing at all unusual that the British authorities at least noted in observing literally thousands of hours of CCTV tapes before they saw the four bombers. In fact, one of the police officers testifying said that around 8:30 a.m. on July 7th, 2005, four men fitting their descriptions are seen hugging. They appear happy, even euphoric. Four longtime friends with backpacks embarking on a long planned upon trip, perhaps hiking out in Devon or in Cornwall or going across the Channel to Europe. Even the youngest, the least sophisticated, the most impressionable, Hussain, the one who was really viewed as the follower, he was observed, and British authorities commented, that his demeanor over this entire period appears relaxed and unhurried. Again, nothing that would have aroused any kind of suspicion. And indeed, this was also the conclusion of the parliamentary committee, who observed that there was nothing in the background of the bombers that was at all exceptional. As I said, three of the four grew up outside of Leeds in a community known as Beastin. Beastin is probably, I haven't been there myself, but from the descriptions, it appears to be something out of perhaps a Dickens novel, sort of the worst excesses of 19th century industrialization in the United Kingdom. Squalid row houses, many of them without indoor plumbing, with privies, in fact, in the back garden. In fact, 2/3 of the residents of Beastin are amongst the poorest 3% of the people in the entire United Kingdom. So it's a very poor area by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, neither Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, Tanweer, or Hussain were poor or underprivileged. And as I said earlier, Tanweer's father was perhaps one of the most prominent and respected businessmen in the community. Also, too, we often have a stereotype that this process of radicalization or even recruitment is going to take place, or will still take place, in the most obvious places, for instance, in the mosques. And I think that's an anachronistic view, not least in the United Kingdom, where many people, especially in the mosques, who have condemned the terrorist attacks on 9/11, for example, have condemned terrorist activity since, and don't want the radicalization in their places of worship. And it's very clear that MSK himself, who probably in all likelihood acted as the recruiter, understood this very clearly, because the British authorities concluded that this plot and the recruitment for it was neither hatched nor conceived nor even carried out in mosques, but rather the kind of place where the police and the authorities, precisely the kind of place where the police and the authorities weren't looking, in the local gym and health club, in an Islamic bookstore and at a social center. And it's believed that MSK, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, played the role of a talent spotter, identifying people who he could draw into the plot and then indoctrinating them, training them behind closed doors. This led the parliamentary committee I described to conclude that no clear profile of a British Islamist terrorist is possible. However, from the videotapes that both MSK and Tanweer made, we do get some idea of what motivated them, and at least perhaps some profile is possible there. Both of them in the tapes are absolutely emphatic that their sense of identity of who they are, that their allegiance is very different from all of ours. I mean, we owe our allegiance or our identity to our country. We view ourselves, if we're Americans, as Italian Americans or Jewish Americans or Chinese Americans and so on. We swear our allegiance to the United States, of course. But both of these men made a point of saying that their allegiance was to their religion and to their community, to the Ummah, to the Muslim community writ large. And they describe themselves, respectively, just as terrorists throughout the centuries have always described themselves, not as the aggressors, not as fanatical, homicidal killers, but rather as reluctant warriors, cast on the defensive, forced to take up arms to defend their community against what they perceived as a predatory, aggressive campaign of war being waged against Muslims worldwide by the United States and, of course, its principal ally, the United Kingdom. And they were quite open in saying not only were they justified in using these suicide terrorist tactics and in targeting innocent individuals, but when you look at their tapes, they almost exult in the sense of individual empowerment, striking a blow against a dreaded, aggressive, hated, more powerful enemy, the sense of catharsis of violence. And I would argue this has been precisely bin Laden's message over the years, the sense of individual empowerment, that you as a person, through an act of terrorism, can change the course of history, that you as a person can derive this enormous sense of satisfaction from a lone act of violence that's directed against your dreaded enemy and hated enemy. Their desire for both vengeance and martyrdom in equal measures is palpable throughout the tape. Indeed, MSK described martyrdom as the supreme, quote-unquote, supreme evidence of his religious commitment. And both MSK and Tanweer, in their martyrdom tapes, laud bin